Hello class, thank you so much for joining me today. If you're watching this after the break, I hope you had a wonderful break. And if you're watching it during the break, congrats on getting ahead. I hope you're having a wonderful break. So what we're going to be doing today is reading another paper, trying to develop economic theory, right, economic framework, to think about social, neighborhood, community influences on people's decisions. This one called Economics and Identity by Rachel Cranton and George Akerlof. So the way this paper came about is that after Akerlof published Social Distance and Social Decisions, right, the paper that we read right before the break, he got a letter from a graduate student that, Rachel Cranton, that essentially said, Dear Professor Akerlof, esteemed economist, who I believe at the time had already won a Nobel Prize, right, big deal. I read your recent paper with great interest. I think you're completely wrong, and, only I can fix it. So please work with me and we'll figure out how to clean up the mess that you made with your last paper. And Akerlof said, that sounds like fun. They collaborated together. They've now written a book together and done a tremendous amount of research working through the idea of how to think about community and social influence on economic decisions. So what was Rachel Cranton's objection to the social distance model, right? The model that we looked at last time. Fundamentally, her objection to it is that it neglected to include consideration of identity when thinking about the way that people influence each other's choices. If we think back to Akerlof's model, particularly the gravity model that we ended with, Akerlof essentially says that people have, received benefits from conforming to others, right, being close to the people around them and their decisions. And those benefits are greater the closer you are to another person, right, along a number of different dimensions. So receiving a similar amount of education to another person brings you closer to them if you also had parents with the same amount of education, right? You grew up in the same sort of environment. Being similar to someone in the accent you speak with brings you, even closer to them if you're also similar to the person and the type of food that you enjoy, right? And as a consequence of this, there's this sort of gravitational force, right, using this analogy to physics, pulling people towards the people who grew up most similar to them and resulting in essentially the creation of social classes, right? Instead of having people, all sorts of mishmash of different activities and identities and behaviors, right, we end up seeing clumps of activities and behaviors among different groups of people who conform to their subculture, right? This is Akerlof's model. What Cranton says is, this idea that people conform the most to those who are most similar to them, right, across a number of dimensions, is overly reductive, right? It's essentially it's missing a lot of important complexity to this process of who people to conform to and in what ways people conform to each other. She says that the way people decide, right, how much to conform to other people isn't just based on their closeness in some objective sense, it's also based on their shared identity or a lack of a shared identity. So if we think back, for example, to persistence through revolutions, we might expect that even children of elite heritages who grew up with, parental incomes, parental education levels, access to food, all sorts of other characteristics that look very, very similar to the children of non-elite heritages they grew up next to, they might not want to conform to children of non-elite heritages because they perceive themselves as different, right? They might care more about conforming to other members of the elite, even if those other members of the elite are different from them in a wide variety of other less salient characteristics. And likewise, right, if we think about under what situations people will conform to a particular person, it's not just going to be some natural, inevitable gravitational pull. It's going to depend on the degree to which a particular decision someone makes threatens or confirms their shared identity. Let's say you're a member of an environmentalist organization, right, at Occidental. You've got a bunch of friends you know through your shared interest in protecting the environment. You might care a lot about conforming to that group of people when it comes to a decision like, should I buy a Hummer? Because if you decide that you're going to go buy a Hummer, all of your environmentalist friends might be pretty offended by that, right? You violated their norms of what an environmentalist is supposed to act like. You might care a lot less, though, about conforming to the norms of your environmentalist friends when it comes to something like how spicy you like your food, because that's going to be a decision that has less relationship, right, is less supportive or antagonistic to your shared identity as environmentalists. So what Cranton is going to say, right, what this paper is going to do is essentially think through the formation of social preferences as essentially a couple of different steps, right? One step is, how do people decide in the circumstances where they have a choice? how to identify, right, what social categories to put themselves in. Do I think of myself as an environmentalist? Do I think of myself as a feminist? Do I think of myself as white? Right? Do I think of myself as a man? And then after that, how are those social categories, both the ones we put ourselves in and the ones that other people perceive us to belong to, influence the social consequences of our decisions? Right? How do the social categories we go into affect the way people perceive the decisions that we make, right? The way that people react to the decisions that we make. How do they affect the way we feel ourselves about the decisions that we make? Okay, cool. So what we're going to do is we're going to try to understand this process, right, of identity formation combined with the influence of identity on people's decisions by using the tools of game theory, right, which I'm trying to name explicitly because I guess I forgot to mention in last class that what we're doing in this unit is game theory, right? But by using the tools of game theory, in order to help us understand when social equilibria, right, combinations of identity and behaviors are stable, right, once everyone behaves in a certain way, everyone has a reason to adhere to the equilibrium, and when they're unstable, right? It'll also allow us to think about when there's multiple equilibria, meaning when we're in a situation where a sufficiently coordinated action to change social outcomes can result in change, and what those coordinated actions can look like. Right, so this is going to be a very useful set of theory if we want to understand the process of social change, right? If we want to know where the pressure points are on cultural and social norms, so that we know either how to change them, right? How to transform destructive cultural norms, or how to preserve them, right? How to avoid the destruction of cultural norms and identities that we think are useful. Okay, wonderful, wonderful, wonderful.